welcome. It's Chris from Christopher Hole Training, and welcome to this whiteboard where we're going to be talking on the topic of barefoot running. And we're going to be looking at the question is, should we wear trainers? Now, this isn't necessarily a whiteboard to suggest that we should or we shouldn't, but what I am going to do is I'm going to be looking at our anatomy and see if that's starting to paint a picture and tell us a story about what it wants us to do. Because I do believe if we can understand the body better, all we then need to do as humans is just act accordingly. If we can start finding the rules and the principles around how our body functions, all we then need to do with our exercise and our movement is then just follow those rules and principles, and we'll be able to reduce our risk of injury, we'll be able to improve our fitness, or just enjoy our physical activity that much more. So what we're going to cover is we're going to look at the foot, we're going to look at the ankle in some basic anatomy. So I'm not going to go into great deals of depth of the anatomy. I'm just going to share with you the basics. Then we're going to look at the tissues of the foot. And then when we get to the tissues of the foot, we're then going to start talking about the functions of the tissues of the foot and the ankle. And then what I'll do is I'll sort of conclude and summarize in the final slide. So before we get into that, I'd just like to mention my social media. So you can go to Twitter, which is @ChristopherHole. You can go to Facebook, which is Christopher Hole Training, or you can go to Instagram, which is Christopher Hole. Like and follow. I'm sharing every day on there, so it'd be great to have you there and to teach you in that way. Alternatively, come to the website, which is christopherhole.com/join, and you can join the monthly newsletter, which is an interactive, engaging newsletter full of video content on everything health and fitness. So please do come along there and sign up, or come along to social media, like and follow. It'd be great to have you at either of them. So to get into slide number 1, the foot. The foot is an amazing part of the body because there's so much going on here. As you can see, it's made up of 26 bones and 24 joints. So within each of these bones there is a joint between it, and there is a degree of movement at that joint. So there's a lot that can go on here, but what we want to try and do is keep it simple, stick to the basic principles of what's happening at the foot, and then we can start to understand sort of the overview of what the foot wants us to do, not necessarily what each bone is telling us what it wants and what each ligament and the muscle and this, that and the other. So we don't want to get too complicated, we want to try and keep it simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to break the foot up into its 3 different parts. So we've got the forefoot, the midfoot and the hindfoot. So the forefoot is from the knuckles to the toes. So you've kind of got these knuckles here, and then you've got the toes, or the phalanges as they're called out here. So it's basically the metatarsals and the phalanges. What we then have is the midfoot, which is 1/6 the length of the foot, and essentially it's the arch of the foot. So it's sort of, again, from where the metatarsals meet the phalanges all the way over onto basically the heel bone, which is where the hind foot starts, which is the heel and the ankle joint. So you've got the hind foot back here. You can't really see the calcaneus, which is the main heel bone, but what you do have then on top of it is the ankle joint. And then you've got the sort of, I guess, the hinge joint at the ankle, and then you've got the talus just below it, which is another joint of the foot, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So I don't want to talk too much about the ankle now, but I just wanted to share those 3 basic parts of the foot, because what I'm going to do when we move further in is I'm going to refer back to this slide to be able to talk more about those different parts of the foot. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the ankle is what sits on top of the hind foot, and it points the toes up and down, and it can point the sole inward and outward. Now when we lift the toes, that's known as dorsiflexion, or when we bend our ankle, that's known as dorsiflexion. When we point the toes down, that's known as plantar flexion, and these are the 2 movements that are available at what is, you could call, the true ankle joint. With regards to the sole pointing inward and outward, which is known as inversion and eversion, this takes place at the tarsal joints. Now the tarsals are these collection of bones here. So this is where the foot sort of turns inward and outward. The ankle consists of lower parts of the tibia and fibula, which are the 2 bones of the lower leg. So the tibia is the big shin bone, and then the fibula is what sits on the outside of that. and the upper portions of the talus, which is this bone here, which again sort of sits on top of the tarsals, and it sits on top of the calcaneus, which is the heel bone. You've then got the lateral and medial malleoli. They deepen the socket into which the body of the talus fits snugly. So you need your talus to be able to move within that joint. It doesn't want to be stiff. It wants to be able to move within that joint to give you that fluid movement of the ankle and proper ankle range of movement. So where there is a lot going on there, what we need to understand is that the ankle joint is essentially moving the toes up, down, and the foot in and out. So it's there to have those movements, to be able to interact with the floor, so it doesn't affect further up the chain. So what we're now going to talk about is the different functions of the tissues of the foot. We'll talk about the bones a little bit, the muscles, the ligaments, the tendons, and also the fascia on the next slide. Now that we understand some of the basic anatomy of the foot and the ankle, what we can now start to do is add some layers to it. So we've looked at some of the bones and some of the movements of the foot. What we're now going to do is put some of the muscles, the tendons, the ligaments, and the fascia on top of that. We're going to talk about some in particular. I'm going to mention what's called the spring ligament, the plantar fascia, the Achilles tendon, the gastroc, and the soleus. Now, there are a lot more muscles, there are a lot more fascia, there are a lot more ligaments, and there are more muscles sort of in and around the lower leg as well. Now, I don't want to go too much into it. I do want to start off basic and start off with the more well-known parts of the foot and add in a couple that may not be so well known. I don't want to overload you with too much information that you'll just lose track of where I'm going and what I'm trying to do. So what we understand so far is that we have three parts of the foot. So you can see sort of part one is where the knuckles of the toes meet the toes themselves. So it's this portion here. Then we've got the midfoot, which is this sort of inward or inside middle part of the foot. And then you've got the hind foot, which is the calcaneus, and this portion at the back of the foot. So what we then have are these spring ligament, the plantar fascia, the Achilles tendon, the gastroc, and the soleus. So the spring ligament is a ligament that you can't really see it on this one, but it sits on the inside of the medial arch, and what it helps to do is it helps to maintain a proper arch, or the proper position of the arch. That goes very much the same for the plantar fascia, which you can start to see here. So you can see the back portion of it. It goes from the heel bone, again, up to the knuckles of the toes. Now, again, what this is there to do is to maintain the arch. We've then got the Achilles tendon, which is a big, thick tendon that sits on the back of the leg, or the lower portion of the back of the leg, and it attaches the heel bone to the gastroc and the soleus. So the gastroc and the soleus are two muscles of the lower leg that are used very much when we are certainly in running. And what all of this is designed to be like is to act like a spring. So when we, let's just say, run from our heel, all of these tissues don't really get used because our heel hits the floor and none of these muscles or ligaments or tendons or fascia engage. When we land on the forefront, or on the forefoot, so the front part of the foot, so the knuckles and the ball of the feet, the spring ligament, the plantar fascia, the Achilles tendon, the gastroc, and the soleus, they all work eccentrically. So what's happening is when the front part of your foot hits the floor, all of these tissues start to lengthen. The plantar fascia lengthens because the front of the foot is being pulled away from the back of the foot. That's the same for the spring ligament, and that's the same for the Achilles and the gastroc and soleus. With regards to the Achilles, when your forefoot hits the floor, your heel slowly moves towards the floor. So it's lengthening the Achilles tendon, the gastroc, and the soleus. So as your forefoot hits the floor, your spring ligament, your plantar fascia, your Achilles, your gastroc, and your soleus is all being lengthened. Now, what this is there to do is when it reaches its full length, it then springs back and propels you forward. So what we're talking about here is the function of the foot certainly when we're running, is for the front part of the foot to hit the floor. All of these tissues then lengthen and act like a spring or an elastic band, get pulled apart, and then spring back to their normal length. So that is then propelling us forward, and we are, in a sense, we're bouncing forward rather than dragging ourselves forward. If we hit our heel on the floor, pull ourselves forward and then bring our leg through and do the same again. So instead of pulling ourselves forward, we're actually springing forward or being propelled forward by these tissues. What we also have is a thick fascia of the lower leg. Now this is to give more compression to bear more load. Now this is quite unique in that a lot of the other areas of the body, the only other area, which is the lower part of the arm, which is much the same, which has a lot of thick fascia around the muscles of the lower leg. Now when our foot hits the floor, there is about 3 to 5 times our body weight going through our foot and our lower leg. Now that, let's just say we're the average human, or the average male I should say, which is of 80 kilos. So our foot hits the floor, let's just times that by 3, so that's 240 kilos, or if we would times it by 5, that's 400 kilos. So there is the equivalent weight going through that lower part of the leg. Now what the thicker fascia is doing, it's compressing around the lower leg, so it's then able to bear that kind of load. Because if it was just the muscles on their own, they wouldn't be able to bear that load. But the compression from thick fascia allows our lower leg to take such great force. What we then have finally is your foot wants shock. Now these are called ground reaction forces. Basically, when our foot hits the floor, it creates a force or a shock within the intrinsic muscles of the foot through the ligaments, the tendons, the muscles, and the fascia. And what that does, that keeps our nervous system aware that we are interacting with the floor. Now, the argument then comes is, well, we haven't been running on tarmac or concrete, on these very hard surfaces. And there would be a degree of truth in that. So what we're talking about when it comes to then trainers, which is what I'm going to talk about in the final slide when I summarize everything, is sort of bringing a little bit more of a different perspective and wrapping up some of this anatomy that I've talked about into a sensible summary that you'd be able to take forward into any further research that you want to do. So that's what we'll go and do now. To conclude or summarize, should we run barefoot or in trainers? Well, it's my belief there is a case for both, because as I mentioned, we are running on harder surfaces than we say used to thousands of years ago, when concrete and tarmac and things like that, roads and pavements weren't around. We were running around on what would be hard mud, but there would be more give in it. So there is a case for both. Now, what I think is more clear is we should be running on our forefoot, whether it's in trainers or not. Now, that's just simply because of our anatomy and the sort of principles it's beginning to share with us, and it's starting to point us in a direction. Because as I mentioned, we've got that thick fascia that compresses around the lower leg. Now, if we land on our heel, the muscles of the lower leg, they don't activate as much. We understand that the plantar fascia, the spring ligament, and the Achilles tendon, they all work best eccentrically, which is the tissues being pulled away from each other and then spring back together. Now that can only happen when we land on the front part of our foot. So the foot is designed to propel us forward like a blade or like a kangaroo. So the easiest example is a kangaroo. As you can see it bouncing forward. We do very much the same when we run, but we just bounce forward on one leg rather than two. So another example of that is a blade that you see the Paralympians run on. They run, the blade hits the floor and it propels them forward, and they sort of bounce forward, if you will. Now, obviously, they're doing that on one leg. We would just do the same principle, just using our forefoot, our midfoot, and then the hind foot around into the lower leg, using all those tissues to propel us forward. So with regards to my perspective and from the research journey that I've been on, that's the conclusion and the summary that I would come to. Because yes, there are a case for both, But whether we run in trainers or not, I do believe running on the forefoot is more advantageous because our anatomy is starting to point us in that direction. So hopefully you found this useful. Hopefully you found some more research points to go and look for, be it the anatomy of the foot, the anatomy of the ankle, and different functions of that anatomy. So yes, many thanks for watching. My name is Chris from Christopher Hole Training. I will speak to you in the next whiteboard.